everyone. Welcome to Radically Loved Radio. I'm your host, Rosie Acosta. And today, I'm very excited to talk to my dear friend, Ethan Nichtern. Ethan is a senior teacher in the Shambhala Buddhist tradition, is the author of The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, and is also the founding director of the Interdependence Project. This is a conversation we're having about relationships, cultivating relationships, and how to create meaningful relationships and connection in our lives. There is a difference between romance and relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think just in general, as a society, what's our general relationship to romantic relationship?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely hard to generalize, but a couple themes where I definitely think the Buddhist teachings are relevant. Just to step back, because this is one of the ways I'm thinking about it as I'm writing about it now. The founder of my tradition, the Shambhala tradition, Chogyam Trungpa, used to talk a lot about theism and non-theism, which he defined differently than, differently from, a belief in God or an atheism. He when he was talking about theism, he was really talking about this idea of the idea that if we put our trust, if we give ourselves over to some savior, then we will be okay. Then we will be safe. Then we'll have salvation. And he was talking about Buddhism as a non-theistic tradition in the sense that it's not about having a savior. It's about working with things as they are. So it's actually a different, rather than thinking about God or no God, it's actually a different way of looking at the whole topic, because it allows us to look at where in our life or where in our culture or society we are falling into the trap of thinking something external is going to save us,
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a lot of us in American culture, since we don't have a very religious culture, for the most part, we have a lot of agnostics and atheists and hipsters and postmodernists who are kind of moving beyond religious labels. But I think in our culture, one of the stories that we still really get caught in this trap of theism or thinking something's going to save us is when it comes to romance.
Mm-hmm.
This notion of this is kind of the narrative of the rom-com, or the romantic comedy, is like that it's somebody's going to come along and save you, and there's a certain plot structure, and it's very heroic, and it's very like finding your person through struggle, and then everything's okay,
Right.
And they never show the part of the rom-com where 5 minutes after the credit roll, they get into their first big fight, and how do they handle that? So that that's the way I'm thinking about it, is looking at the theism, or the sort of the getting caught in the trap of looking for an external savior related to our sense of romance, and then on the other side, I think you could define sort of our more hardcore cynical approach as this apathy towards that. There's a kind of like backlash against the idea of a soulmate or a romantic savior. So people kind of give up on the idea of romantic relationships altogether.
Right. It becomes very cynical at that point.
Yeah. Right. So Buddhism always tries to find the middle path between those extremes of salvation and nihilism, and say, well, what's the middle path? It's like actually showing up and working with things, working with yourself, working with people as they are. So I do think there's, I think the reason I love the way that Chogyam Trungpa talked about theism and non-theism is it really helps you look at not just religious beliefs, but how we sort of energetically or psychologically put all our eggs in the basket of like, this thing is going to, save me. And for some people, it's our career or it's our creative work. But I think it has such a particularly charged quality of wanting to feel accepted, wanting to feel loved, and thinking that if we find the right person, we're not going to have any more problems dealing with our own heart and mind, and I think that's the big myth, or that's the big trap, is actually, one of the things I've found is not only is communication really important, but being able to have a good conflict and argument with someone that you're dating or in a serious partnership with, or a long-term relationship, is actually, it's a great practice. It's in my life, when I've been in relationships where we didn't argue, it was actually highly problematic. 'Cause it meant we weren't really hearing each other.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I actually think that that's a really great point that you bring up, is this idea where we think like we're not supposed to argue or we're not supposed to create conflict because conflict means
Mhm.
something's wrong,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so in your experience, when you've encountered that conflict, how have you dealt with that? Like, what I'm saying is, like, when you weren't arguing, like, did you know after a while, like, wow, we've never had a fight and now there's a big problem? Like, how did you know that there was an issue?
Well, usually, I feel like the way I've, connected with knowing, hey, there's something off here, is when it gets into that space where there's a lot of unsaid or said assumptions about what the other person thinks or feels. Usually when you don't argue well or don't have arguments, a lot of conversations get into the space where one person is just kind of speaking for the other person, and
Yeah.
not really checking in, because
Mhm.
that's this really interesting thing about relationship, right? If if we were in a relationship with somebody who was just like us, or somebody who agreed with us, or somebody whose subjective experience of the universe was identical to us, we wouldn't be in a relationship. We'd just be with ourselves, So within this quest for a relationship, or romance, there's an actual desire to mingle with something that's not you.
Mhm.
And which means you have to actually open the space to empathize and have conflict of like, oh, really? You like that? I don't, and from little conversations to big ones, like just like which sponges to buy. My fiance and I disagree sometimes about what the best sponge is for doing the dishes. Luckily we're in that's a good situation, because it means we're in a relationship where both of us are doing dishes.
This is a quality conflict.
Yeah, but that means we're both actually involved in the situation. So it's good that we actually have a disagreement about like which sponges we should get, because it means we both like actually care about our life together,
Right.
So in the moment it could feel a little petty, or feel like I can't believe this other person sees the world differently from me, But that's actually, this is the problem with samsara from a Buddhist standpoint, is if you actually look at what your heart is longing for to get into a relationship, it's longing for something that's not you. It's longing for a being who has their own unique or different approach to the universe. So you're actually you're saying, I'm attracted to somebody who loves me, and somebody I can really build trust and support with, but also somebody who has a different perspective on things. So if, in a sense, when you're in a relationship, you have to accept that you actually got what you asked for.
Right.
You wanted something other than you. Now here that is.
I kind of want to touch on that a little bit with what we're talking about as far as creating this type of connection or this type of presence in relationship, is expectation, right? And again, we can spend a whole afternoon talking about expectation, but I think that what you're saying is just being really clear with what you're wanting to bring to the table. And for me, I find increasing value in the practice of being transparent, right? So to
Mm-hmm.
repeatedly quiet the expectations of pretense, to allow myself to feel more connected, and to just be really clear with what I'm bringing to the table, and what my, expectations are, or what I would feel like kind of held up in the relationship, or feel like they're meeting me halfway. I've been in a long-term relationship. Tori and I have been together for 11 years, and it's been a back and forth. We've grown a lot,
Hmm.
and we've been able to kind of navigate the growth and the peaks and the waves of the relationship, and always coming back to that, to being transparent, to being clear on. So it's exactly what you're saying, and I think that that's something that's really important, especially with you know single people out there dating now with all of these apps and all of these things, and like
Yeah.
wanting this amazing, really wanting the fairy tale, right? Like what you're saying, like having, the knight in shining armor, or like the princess walk in, and whatever it is, like this whole idea that we get attached to, that relationship needs to look like this, and my partner needs to be this way, and I need to find him or her, and these are my expectations, and then when I'm not met with them, all of a sudden I'm just disappointed and I'm disillusioned by the whole um the whole journey, or like the whole dating process.
I think transparency is a really important thing. I think it's also important if you're a teacher of any kind of spiritual or psychological or wellness tradition. I think, there's, and this is one of the things I'm working with in my next book, is like, how could I be transparent about my own process, not to put myself forward as a relationship expert, because again, I don't think there is such a thing as a relationship expert. It's kind of an oxymoron. There's a relationship practitioner, and I think there are people who are really well trained to help other people with their relationships. But to say that you can, master your own relationship, that's a very manipulative statement, actually, because a relationship is at least two people, and an expert or a master is one person, so it's kind of, it has this oxymoronic quality.
Yeah,
But I
it
really
creates
think,
separation, right?
yeah, and it also has a feeling of like, I know what I'm doing, when the whole point of a relationship is to show up and have good tools for working with opening your heart and being flexible and not knowing what's going to happen next. And and I think that's what our meditation and yoga practices are, is to create greater flexibility, so that when life happens, you have the tools to be flexible, not knowing what's going to happen. And but the thing you said about transparency, I also think it's really important not just to be transparent to your partner or to people you're dating, but I think it's really important for teachers to be transparent, not exhibitionist, but transparent about our process, because I think there is this tendency, and it's very clear that this is the only time spiritual teachers get into trouble, is when their students expect them to be not human in their own process, and then they somehow buy into that, that expectation as like, okay, well, since you put me on this pedestal that I'm a different type of human being, I have to play to that now, and that's when every teacher scandal that's happened in the Buddhism and yoga community has happened. Is there's a sense of the teacher is no longer allowed to be kind of a transparent human with their own sexual desires, et cetera. And it was interesting. I watched the movie Spotlight the other day. Have you seen
I've
that
not
movie?
seen it, but it's on my list. I
Yeah,
saw a
and
preview and it looked great.
yeah, it did look, it was a great movie, really well sort of journalistic approach to this really great cast to this scandal in Boston of the very widespread, true story Catholic priests molesting underage boys, mostly. I think a few girls, but mostly boys. And it was this interesting thing, because it took this classical, like, we have to do justice, we have to get these bastards, But the whole time I was thinking is like, maybe because this problem was so widespread, and there are actually some stories in Tibet of ancient Tibet of similar problems in monastic communities. I don't believe they were nearly as widespread, but I don't know. But so the whole time I was thinking, like, maybe part of the problem is you've created this situation where the spiritual teacher has to suppress their own sexuality and then has no way to work with that suppression. I mean, how else could it be this widespread that that priests are are molesting boys? There has to be something about what you've asked them to do that kind of goes against their humanity, and so that was the thought. I mean, just the subjective, personal thought that I had during that. And I think it's really important in the 21st century for meditation yoga teachers to have really good conduct, but to also be, it's okay, especially if you're teaching a worldly tradition like you or I are, to be a being with a sexual side and to actually be transparent about that, which doesn't mean you hit on your students. I mean, that's
right. I would love to ask you about that, because that's another thing that's really huge in this realm, right? It's like that separation between I'm in this quote unquote leadership role, you're the
right.
student, and then there's like this fake sort of veil that happens where it's like all of a sudden you know everything, you quote unquote you're the person that has all the answers.
Right.
And if I'm seeking answers, I'm going to be drawn to that. Right. And so
Right.
again, like if I don't have the tools to be clear with what is actually happening, and me not be able to see that what I'm drawn to is this ability to learn these teachings or to evolve as a human, instead I think like, oh, I'm really attracted to this teacher and like what he's saying, and oh my God, like he's really hot and I just really want to hang out with him, and he's got all the answers, and maybe this is the person I've been looking for. Oh my God, she's beautiful and she's really attractive and
Right.
she looks great in yoga clothes, and maybe she's got all the answers, so
Right.
so yeah, I think that that's definitely something to be considered, and it does fall into the same line with that being transparent and being able to be clear with what it is that you're wanting. I feel like for the things that are happening right now in the dating world, or people seeking romantic relationship, is like there just seems to be a lot of cloudiness around it's they're more concerned with somebody fitting into an archetype, or them fulfilling a void, right? It's like it's what you said earlier. It's like I won't be happy until fill in the blank. Or when I find my perfect mate, then I will begin to feel joy, or then I will feel my value, or then I'll find my self-worth. And it's like at what point do we start to really turn in and create the relationship with ourselves? So it's like I remember a Dharma talk, a couple of years ago, in LA, and I can't remember the gentleman who gave the talk, but I remember, and it stuck with me pretty like deeply. He said something like, to begin the exploration of relationship, you need to take inventory of how related you feel to the situations in your life. And for that really struck a chord with me, and it really kind of just shifted my perspective with like, okay, wait, so I have to make an inventory about how related I feel to others. I'm like, how is that? I couldn't really make the connection at that point. But after a while, I was like, oh, okay, I get it. The relatedness is an inner felt experience, right? That I know in my heart. So I have to go in. I have to I have to ask myself. I have to go in and do that practice to be able to begin to explore those things.
Right. I think it's also, I think that the key thing is a clarity of intention, and coming back to like, so let's, there's, if we're talking about the dating phase, which was how you started talking about that, it's like, so if you go on Tinder, which is an app I've never used, but a lot of friends use it, and I think it has some potentially beneficial aspects to it. What is your, are you clear about your intention for what you're looking for and why? Because you're going to be able to communicate with people clearly from that intention. You're going to be able to hear what other people's intention is. So I feel like that's, that the times when we actually do the most harm to ourselves and others are when we're not clear about what we want and what we're trying to do, you know, and that's for my friends. And, you know, I am, you know, very happy to be getting married this year and to be, you know, knock on wood, not going back into the real samsaric whirlpool of, you know, dating in America, in an American cosmopolitan city in the 21st century. But I think, you know, a lot of the frustration that people hear is that there seems to be so much confusion about intention, you know. So whenever somebody's harming themselves or harming others or feels dissed or hurt by somebody else, it's because not a clear sense of like, so this is what I'm looking for, you know, I like you, what are you looking for? You know, we're just not willing to be transparent because we're not in touch with our own intention, you know, which is, I think, about, it's hard to be in touch with your own intention because you have to sort of assert a kind of presence and a desire to move your mindful energy in a certain direction, which can be very scary to actually say, okay, this is what I want, you know. It can, to actually hold one seat, which is the way we talk about it in Shambhala, and say, here's what I am, here's where I am, here's what I stand for. You know, I think we're living in a generation that's kind of really, really afraid of sort of asserting like, this is what I'm all about, you know. And the last thing I want to say is I wanted to give a Buddhist defense of superficiality or superficial attraction, at least, as, I mean, obviously it's highly problematic, but that there's an actual human reason that part of the way attraction works is superficial, you know. So I don't want to just reject it out of hand. You know, I've thought about this, like when I was thinking about Tinder, right? I think you swipe left or swipe right if you like the person, and then if they swipe left too, then you can talk
match
to each
up
other
or something. Yeah, like you get matched and then you're able to communicate. Yeah.
And in a way, I was thinking, like, you know, this is sort of compassionate because it gets out of the way that really awkward part in any social situation at a party or a bar where you're like, does this person think I'm cute at all? Like, should I even waste my time? Like, there's a sense, I mean, maybe it also ruins the mystique of all those anxious thoughts, which to me have their own appreciation. But there's also a way of looking at it that, like, you do have to establish, yes, they are attracted to me, I am attracted to them. And I think sometimes in more spiritual connotations, we think like to start with the surface that way is like somehow it's too reductive or something like that. And, you know, the way I like to think about it is everything has a surface. You know, the only way to connect with something is to start with the surface of what that thing is. And the only way to connect with a person is to be attracted to something that you experience on their surface. And that's not the problem. The problem is when there's nothing underneath the surface or the relationship doesn't move beyond a superficial level that it becomes problematic. So it's not that I think attraction always starts at the surface. And if we go into some sort of spiritual guilt mode about that, we're never going to actually make it deeper than the surface anyway, you know? I just think we have to leave space for like, it's really what I was feeling having seen Spotlight is like, nobody's addressing the real problem here, which is like, there is something to human sexuality. It can be awakened. It can be used compassionately. And if you try to suppress it, that's when you're really going to run into problems. And I think the notion, you know, that some Buddhist people feel is like, oh, if I'm attracted to him or if I'm attracted to her, that's superficial, and, you know, I have to reject those thoughts, or I should be attracted to somebody I'm not. It's just like, that's not the way reality works, you know?
Right. Yeah, I think that's really...
We're trying to be compassionate within reality.
Right. Let's be compassionate, but let's be real too.
Yeah. Well, that's the only way to be compassionate.
Yeah, it's true. I have a question just to kind of touch on something that you said, and this is something that I've been curious about. It's like, you know, the whole connection online. Um, you talked about, you said something to the point of like the mysticism kind of being diluted. You didn't say that, but like in so many words, that's kind of what I
Mhm.
got from it, right? From dispelling sort of that initial awkwardness when meeting somebody because you've already kind of in a way been quote unquote accepted or approved, right?
Mhm.
It's been like you got the go ahead. But
Right.
I feel like, do you think that a little bit of that, like human, and I say human connectedness in the way of like touch and presence, and like the way that we can talk online or via email can have a different tone when we're in person, right? So it's like somebody can have a really great connection on like say a Tinder or like a match.com, and like all of a sudden they meet in person and it's like that spark just isn't there. And I'm
Mhm.
finding that more and more. So it's almost like this sort of the web that is technology that's created this connection between us all that's beautiful and great. And I think it's an amazing tool, and it allows us to do what we do and reach a lot of people. But also there's that sense of disconnection too, to that humanness, that interaction where it's like, I don't want to text with you on the phone. Like I want to, let's go to a coffee shop. Let's like go hang out in
Mhm.
person and see each other, and like be able to
Yeah.
have that sort of connection. And I feel like that the way that we meet people nowadays, that little bit of magic is kind of gone, right?
Mhm.
So, in regard to romance and relationship, how do you think that plays a role, or does it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think cognitively, there's definitely evidence, and there's so much experiential evidence that uh, things feel richer and fuller when your sense perceptions are like actively, and your just emotional perception is actively immersed in a connection with somebody. So it's just something about the way our brains, hearts, minds work that when you are present with somebody live, like I'm sure we would be like I feel very connected to this conversation, but I'm sure if we were having it over coffee and we were both seeing each other's hand expressions, etc., that there'd be even more resonance. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's totally true, and you have to make time to really be present with people. And um, yeah, I think especially I do think there's something. I think it would be a real shame, from the standpoint of my experience, from the standpoint of the Shambhala teachings, if technology acted to remove the experience of vulnerability from
Mm-hmm.
the human psyche, because the experience of vulnerability is such an amazingly awakened experience. To
Yeah.
actually use that as a source of strength, like to actually there's really nothing like it. I mean, when
Mm-hmm.
I teach things online sometimes, but like when there's a group of people in a room, like I gave a lecture at the Rubin Museum, and every time I lecture in a group of people, even though I do it a lot, there's a moment of nervousness, and just that moment, there were about 150 people there of being introduced, and you're like, oh, I'm a real person here with other real people. That wouldn't happen if it was just a podcast, or. So I think
Right.
the same thing in friendship, the same thing in relationship, romance. Um, but I also think, the same thing to the superficial thing that I was saying about the sort of everything has a surface, is the technology can facilitate initial connections in a way that I think is very powerful and is very useful as a tool. It can help us, like you and I have a friendship. We didn't have to meet in person to make that happen,
Mm-hmm.
which is very new.
Mm-hmm.
And if you and I never had a cup of coffee together, then I would say, yes, something's lacking. And I would probably go into my old curmudgeon mode about, the problems with technology and isolation, throw in a few, critiques of millennial culture or
Right.
what have you. But
these kids lack connection.
But but I think it's wonderful that we were able to, you can meet people online first. So I think it has a lot to do with view and intention, which is why those are the first two parts of the teachings of the Buddhism's Eightfold Path, is because it creates the sort of framework for everything that comes after. If your view is, I want to make myself vulnerable, I want to genuinely connect with people, and the way I use technologies to make initial connections, then I think technology could be one of the best things ever. If your view is like, I don't want to be vulnerable, so I just want to have these kind of half-hearted, isolated relationships with people, then that's probably going to lead to a more isolated and more cut off and less awake place.
I can see where that would create a huge void in our ability to just create meaningful relationships. Can you just, I don't know, tell us a little bit about the difference between what makes a relationship romantic and what doesn't? And I would ask, is it important? I know it's important. I'm sure you know it's important. But I don't know that we focus enough energy in relationships now that focus around that romance, because again, like I was saying, I feel that a lot of that mysticism has kind of been diluted a little bit. What do you think?
I'm sure it's something, you think of in your relationship. I definitely think of it. I think, my friends who have small children, it adds a whole nother level of like, how do you keep the fire going when you move into more, project of raising other sentient beings? How do you keep your own passion together going?
Mm-hmm.
I think, I think it's this blend of familiarity and curiosity, which is always really interesting, because I really feel like the kind of moving deeper into being awake, one way I put it in my new book is that I'm working on, is really thinking about, like, one, that we always have to approach things with beginner's mind, So the root of romance is having an experience that's new, that's fresh, that is invigorating, that's not the routine, And I think that's sort of this notion of beginner's mind, is allowing yourself to be surprised. But I think the other idea is actually knowing your partner well, and so it's that combination of like adding new things, but also knowing who the other person is and where they're coming from, and knowing how to play off that. It's a really interesting balancing act it's kind of like, you go out for a walk and you've been around the block before, but this time around is completely fresh,
Mm-hmm.
I do think you have to try new things constantly in a relationship. And that's, whenever somebody says it takes work, I think that's a big part of the work. I think the other big part of the work is making time and space to communicate, have conflict, have disagreement. But I think a lot of the work is like, I'm going to keep pushing myself to try to find new ways that we could relate to each other, At the same time, it's okay if you have something of a routine sometimes. So I think it's, for me, it's like finding, like, I have a date night tomorrow night, and I'm trying to think, and this is literally happening. I'm trying to think, like, what can we do that we haven't done recently,
Right.
But also I'm thinking, like, what could we do that we would both like, So that's that blend of like beginner's mind and familiarity,
Yeah.
I have to know my partner well, but I have to know my partner well enough to surprise her in a way that's interesting.
Right. That's not like, oh, we're going here again.
Yeah. So
or sometimes that's nice.
Sometimes it is nice, right? But if you go there again, could you have a new experience going there again? So it's a really interesting balancing act. I think, again, the important thing is that you want to practice. You want to use your relationship as like, okay, let's use this time to practice, rather than like, can't we just have an easy time? Can't we just, You know, can't we just know that we love each other? Just like, why do we have to do anything? You know, I think that kind of energy can be very cocoonish. You know, in the Shambhala tradition, it's like you're just trying to get into a cocoon and stay there. So, yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah,
Your
I mean, no,
relationship is
I
longer than
like
mine.
that. I like that too. No, but I mean, it's been kind of like a long process of,
Mm-hmm.
you know, getting to know each other and keep making those things, everything that you're saying. I mean, we are both self-employed. You know, we both run our own
Mm-hmm.
business, and it's important for us to be able to make time together. A couple, we did our own podcast talking about our relationship like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, it is a balancing act, and it is important to spend time together. It is important to engage in healthy conflict. It's important for us to be able to miss each other too. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we work really closely together as far as like space. So
Mm-hmm.
separation is quite nice sometimes. And
Yeah.
um I travel and he travels sometimes, and it's kind of great to just get that. We have 3 dogs, so then we're parents to 2 little Frenchies and a little Shih Tzu, and this is like our little tribe, and we make it a point to
Nice.
connect. And um, you know, in all the ways, you know, we make time
Mm-hmm.
to have a tea date. Like we have a tea date once a week, and we have a date night once a week. And so we'll go
Right.
do, you know, tea ritual, and then we'll go have, you know, dinner and a movie, you know, or we might stay in.
Mm-hmm.
But those are like the 2 pretty constant things that we at least like to keep,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in connecting, and we really use that time to connect. Like I don't know if you and Marissa ever, you know, spend those days or you know, nighttime where you guys just talk and talk and talk, and it's just like
Yeah.
you just can
Yeah.
talk
Yeah.
forever, right? It's like that. Those are the that's like the time for talking to each other, just being with each other. That's like that's where you begin to feel that. To me, that's romantic. Like
Right.
you don't have to take me out to a fancy dinner and a movie, and like to me I'm like, wow, you put gas in my car. Like when I got in my car and it was full of gas, it was empty last night, and to me I'm like, that's romantic. You know,
Right. Right.
or
Right.
being able to like put toilet paper in the bathroom when it's running out. You know,
Right.
those types of things. I think it's the little things of just it's that care, that attention to detail that
Mm-hmm.
really helps spark that connection for me. So yeah, I mean it's all a balancing act, and it's not always easy, but I think that it's definitely it's work, you know, it's not easy
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
by any means. So in closing, can you tell us a little bit about the book that you're writing?
Oh yeah. 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 Well, it's not gonna be out till 2017, fall of 2017. So in the meantime, uh, the second section of the road home is really called the journey of relationships, and
Right.
it's a lot of Buddhist teachings modernized on relationships. But I wanted to write a book specifically about relationships, but again, I didn't want to write it as a relationship expert. So that's kind of theme one is of the 3 themes in the book are that there's no such thing as a relationship expert, but Buddhism does offer some really great tools and teachings for how to be present in relationships. Theme 2 is that personal stories work better than abstract philosophy, you know, when it comes to spiritual teachings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so like for example, Pema Chodron, who's, you know, one of the probably the most famous teacher in my tradition, when people find out that her husband was cheating on her, and she, you know, threw objects at him, tried to burn down his house. You know, that's what really endears them to her. They want to hear her path. You know, so
Yeah.
it's about that notion of transparency and sort of decoding this idea that a spiritual teacher is supposed to be like other than human. and how problematic that idea is. And then the third theme is really to pay homage to kind of this notion that culture, and especially pop culture, is a huge part of our spiritual narrative, which may feel like a downer, but actually, there was a book written called The Dharma of Star Wars, by my first publisher. And just to kind of acknowledge that we're swimming in this cultural landscape, and that's where we get a lot of our stories, our spiritual stories from. So it's a little bit of a genre-bending book, but it's basically 30 years of learning about Buddhism against 30 years of trying to be decent in relationships. And the three types of relationships I take on in the book are friendship, romance, and family relationships. And all of that in 30 years of loving The Princess Bride, which is my favorite movie. So, which is all about those three types of relationships. So it's called The Dharma of the Princess Bride. So it'll be out just before, I think, the 30th anniversary of The Princess Bride, which is fall of 2017.
Oh, that's so, I love The Princess Bride. It's so good. That's so, when I first saw that when I first saw that you were doing that, I was like, wow, this is going to be so great. This is going to be so great because I could see how everything that you're talking about relates to the story and how it could relate to our lives and where we are as a society, and that's that sort of relationship narrative that we're in. I think it would be very relatable, and I'm really excited, and I can't wait to read it. That's exciting. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for listening to Radically Loved Radio. For more information, you can go to radicallyloved.com. You can follow me on all the social media outlets, Instagram at Rosie Acosta, Twitter at Rosie Acosta, Love Radically on Facebook, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other things that I'm not mentioning, but I'm sure you will find them if you're looking for them. Thanks for listening.